Sure. I'm Dr. Derek Boeckner. I'm in the math department. My dissertation was on some probabilistic graph theory stuff. It probably doesn't mean a lot to many people in here, but I kind of think of myself more as a general mathematician, at least at this level. I work with kind of anything, and my current research is more in time scales and still discrete stuff, but it's not the same thing with graph theory.
We're supposed to talk about our dissertation. The classes at this point. Yeah, I'm John Dettman, Chair of Modern Languages. I am a Latin Americanist, cultural critic and scholar. My dissertation was on post-Soviet human fiction, somewhat of an arcane topic, I guess. But generally, I look into things like geography, race. I'm into kind of crime fiction and detective novels, and so forth in Latin America.
I'm Dr. David Rozema, the chair of the philosophy program. And my interest is in the connection between literature and philosophy. So I read a lot of literature and a lot of philosophy with it and try to see the connections between those things. My dissertation was actually on Kierkegaard and what he calls the paradox of existence. So if you ever want to know what that is, just come talk to me.
I'm Brian Artman, Dr. Artman. I teach in the teacher ed department in the College of Education. I got one former student sit up there, so that makes me feel good. Before I came here, I taught in the public schools for 15 years. So my interests are more about how teachers use technology, one-to-one technology classrooms. I'm also kind of starting a research project on how teachers and coaches, athletics coaches, use social media in their jobs.
Well, hello, my name is Dr. Mike Teahon. I'm in the College of Education in Educational Administration. I'm pleased to be up here with such smart people. So my actual dissertation was on assessment in schools. And my focus of my research is on leadership development at all levels in schools, all the way from the teacher leader level to superintendents and principals and those types of things. So leadership is a big thing to me. And honestly, education is my passion. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, John, for inviting me. My name is Frank Kovacs. I am in the chemistry department. I do research on protein biochemistry is my area of research, and I won't even talk about my dissertation.
All right, awesome. Thank you, everyone. So the first question, you guys don't have to answer this in any order. Just whoever wants to speak first is welcome to speak. And the first question is, what does it mean to have a well-rounded education? What subjects should be included in a well-rounded education? And who should pursue this kind of education? Any thoughts that would come from that?
I'll go first and say I was first. Because I've just left the public school classroom a couple of years ago. And so not to reproduce too many of the catchphrases from the schools. Well-rounded means you're, as a school in the schools, you're not just becoming somebody who can do math and science and social studies, but you're also becoming, my schools use the term citizen quite a bit. A good citizen, well-rounded citizen, productive citizen who knows not to bully, how to go about the right way, so that when you leave, the high school setting, you are prepared to either go get a job or go to any sort of secondary education, whether that's trade school, community college, four-year college. Just that you're not just, hey, I know a bunch of math, so what? I don't have anything else. So that you're prepared both socially, mentally, emotionally, and academically to, leave that pre-K-12 environment and have a life that's worth having.
I guess I could go next. When I think of well-rounded, I think of the person as a whole being. And so education ought to address or help each person in every part of their being. So this would include the mind, would include the heart, would include what we might call the soul. It would include your physical health. So it tries to address the person as a whole, and it wouldn't be just simply a matter of taking this, taking that, and taking courses that kind of address all the issues of when you're healthy in all those areas, but to try to see how they all fit together as well, so that you can, in your own being, can harmonize all those aspects of your education, see how they all fit together. I think an education, well, maybe to preface my remark on this, I think about that word discipline. We often talk about our disciplines and we separate them according to subject matter. But if you think about the word itself, it means doing something. So you're disciplined if you're a master at doing something. So education can't simply be a matter of gaining a certain amount of information and knowledge in a subject area. It has to include, well, how has this subject and studying this subject disciplined you? Your mind, your actions, your emotions, maybe your physical activities and so on. Are you a disciplined person in all of these areas? So I think a well-rounded education should take into effect not just what you're studying, but how it shapes your practices, how it shapes the patterns in your life. How I think about it.
I like what you said, David, about discipline. And I can't remember who said this, but there's a quote that says, you can either suffer the pain of discipline or the pain of disappointment. And I think oftentimes that's true when we're thinking about our own process of learning, acquiring skills and so forth. To answer the question, what is a rounded education? It's a bit of a leading question, right? Because it's supposed to take us down the path to say it's the liberal arts, right? It's everything. It's all the disciplines. Yeah, I mean, we're supposed to think about a well-rounded individual, right? The formation of a human with core knowledge in various academic disciplines, the ability to appreciate art, beauty, etc. But increasingly, we are told either with words or with the withdrawal of material support that actually, no, we don't really need to create the so-called well-rounded individual. So I think one of our tasks has to be to ask why the well-rounded individual, educated according to the liberal arts tradition, no longer seems to be desirable, or at least not worth investing in for the majority of parents, politicians, and donors. And if we can answer that question, we can perhaps also understand the condition of the humanities in higher education today.
All right, I'll jump in. So my really philosophy of education and a well-rounded education is based on a lot of years of working with kids and parents and adults. And something that I would refer back to is the whole child concept that we talk about throughout our schools and what that means. I think one of the things that really has become evident in the last few years is the importance of making and allowing education to be what the individual student, child, or adult learner needs in their life. Especially with the advent of social media and the internet and technology and some of those types of things. People have access to all sorts of resources. And a well-rounded student is able to look at those types of things and interpret what is real, what is not real, what applies to their own specific situation, and how it moves them forward. I think a big thing that we do, and I've talked about this for a long time, is our goal in education is to take children or adults where they are and help them get to beyond where they believe they can go. Because that in itself impacts our entire population and helps us grow as a society. The challenge is we have to allow and help our young people become critical thinkers, be able to interpret data, and then take that and go and do with it. Now, I do think it changes, and this is unfortunate, but changes upon where you live and the society in which you are going to contribute. And so as we look at the whole child, I think we have to be able to adapt and move. I can use an example. As a former administrator, I worked in the Sand Hills, Nebraska. If you've been up into the rural schools and the rural communities, it can be very isolated. And what we always found is adaptability to environment was critical to be able to bring people in and retain them and to fill our work for our jobs, work on the ranches, do those types of things, and work in schools. For a person that we always hear in Nebraska, if for Nebraska people, we understand this, but where does Western Nebraska start? I think that's all relative. I've spent a lot of time working throughout Nebraska, working with legislators and working on policy and some of those types of things. And I had a good friend that was in the legislature. She lived in North Omaha, and she caught me in the hearing. She came out to actually talk to me. She said, "Mike, I want you to know something. I went clear out west to Wahoo last week." And which, again, if you think about that, that's relative. And when we prepare the whole child, we have to understand they're going to have different experiences. In higher education, that applies because we're going to send our young people out across the country and the world. And so we have to prepare them as a whole child to be able to adapt and to thrive in the environment in which they're placed as they make a difference.
So, as a mathematician, when I think rounded, I think no corners, no edges. But that sort of leads me to thinking, okay, it's a fluid sort of thing. There's a smoothness to it, and it means that you're adaptable. You're able to take your knowledge from one area and flow into other areas, right? And so to be well-rounded in your education means you have no corners. You can always get from one area of knowledge to another area through things that you have been exposed to. And that means it's sort of all subjects and no subjects, right? It's more of how do you think rather than what do you think? And the audience, as the third part of the question was, is anybody that wants to grow in their ability to think, adapt to that's that growth mindset that you hear about in the elementary schools, in the classrooms, all the way up through college. You need that growth mindset to be able to say, okay, what do I know and what more can I know? It's the ability to take those steps is what, to me, a well-rounded education will give you.
Oh, well, I would probably, great thoughts. I would probably address this mainly just from my experience and say that I think for me, the well-rounded education question has to do with, I like a lot of what was said about the critical thinking skills, because one of the things being in the sciences is that you become really quickly overwhelmed with the amount and volume of information. I mean, we truly live in like the information age, and it's easy to just become overwhelmed by it. And it's even easy to become very selective in the information that you will like listen to, or the particular things. But I think that a well-rounded education probably starts with some sort of like basic foundational type of courses, right? I mean, obviously reading, being able to read, that's a foundational thing. I think that being able to think about how we have come to be where we are culturally, I think is an important aspect of a well-rounded education, because we didn't get here like instantly, like, right? I mean, all of us sort of feel that way when you're born and you think, wow, everything is so new. But as you begin to learn a little bit about the history of ideas and history of things, there's in many ways, a lot of the well-rounded education, I think sometimes we get this idea that it's like, well, you got to know the newest and the latest and the most modern things. But I think really knowing the more ancient things and understanding that there's really very little new. I mean, there's a lot of ancient wisdom. So I think well-rounded education would probably start off with something that's very foundational and old, and then understand where civilization as we experience it, where it comes from, and then kind of build on that, but in a very holistic approach. Because I know each of us, it's very easy, you get into your specialty. So like I'm in chemistry, but I'm not just in chemistry. I'm in biochemistry, but I'm not just in biochemistry. I'm in protein biochemistry. And I'm not just in protein biochemistry, right? My focus is on a particular kind of protein. And I think that's one of the problems that we have sometimes with education. as educators, we're so narrowly focused on our specialty, our specialized area. It's hard for us to kind of integrate and talk amongst ourselves. And so this year I've gotten the opportunity to do the 126 with Dave. And I've enjoyed it a lot because I've been able to learn a lot from Dr. Jensen, who's teaching about, from astronomy perspective. I'm teaching from chemistry perspective, and Dave's teaching from the, he starts next week on the philosophy of the question that we're addressing. And I think that well-rounded education is definitely multidisciplinary, and you have to, part of the discipline is breaking out of your little narrow specialty and trying to develop this bigger picture that's civilizational, that's cultural, and kind of broad in that regard.
Do you guys have anything? This is the point. If you guys have anything you would like to ask each other or develop upon each other, you can. Otherwise, I'll ask the next question.
Yeah, as we were talking, when I was an undergraduate, I had a very special philosophy professor, and he would often talk about education. And he would talk about, he'd say, it looks to us like education is one unified thing, but there's actually two kinds of education. There's education for freedom and the education for slavery. And of course, I was really puzzled by what he meant. But as I talked with him more and got to know him better, what I understood was education for slavery is the kind where you're trained to pretty much do one certain kind of thing or to follow these orders, and you're not able to solve a problem that much on your own. You don't know when you're being taken advantage of, like a slave might. You don't really, you're not really taught the virtues so that you can break out of internal forms of slavery where you're a slave to your desires or to your passions, and you can't even break out of that. So what he meant by freedom was really freedom at the level not of politics or of public freedom, but how can you be free from the worst parts of yourself? And that's always stuck with me. And he would often tie that in with this notion, which at the time was really big, I guess it's still big, this saying that what we're trying to get students to do is to think for themselves. And he would always agree with people that said that, but he said, but first, you have to teach them to think. And man, it's just those little sayings, they get you, they provoke these thoughts. What do you mean by that? But it strikes me, we're not just born thinkers. We have to learn to think. And that's important. You can't think for yourself until you can think.
So if I would add to that, so a lot of times our young people are pigeonholed based upon their background. And so if we look at whether they be young people as children in our schools or even in higher education, to what you've said about being pigeonholed to a discipline area, or what you talked about being able to think for yourself, a lot of times we don't know what we don't know. I hear that question, how do you know what you don't know? And I think part of that opportunity is we talk about a well-rounded education in the future is by allowing children to, again, reach for places they don't know that they can hit is really important. And so thinking for yourself and being able to do those types of things becomes critically important. I was a first generation student coming out of a small farm in central Nebraska. And I think back to it's been forever ago, but I think about, I didn't really know that there were very many career options for me. And so it was actually, it was here at Kearney State at the time. I thought I wanted to be an architect and found out I couldn't draw. That was an issue at that point. It might not be as big an issue now with all the technology involved, but at that point, other opportunities were made available for me, allowing me to change. And so I think by giving young people the ability to see what is out there so they know what they don't know, I think that it gives them better opportunity to make those steps.
So building on David's comments about education for freedom versus education for slavery, there's kind of a distinction that can be made philosophically between freedom and necessity. Right? And it has been said that the realm of freedom begins where the realm of necessity ends, right? And so thinking about education, right, there's a certain part of your education that is devoted to making you ready to survive in the world, right? To earn a paycheck, right? That's why most of us are here, let's be honest, right? So we can get that seal of approval that says we're ready to be an employee somewhere or a boss, you know, even better, right? But there's the things we do in terms of our educational path that are oriented towards that realm of necessity, right? The true freedom begins where that ends, right? Freedom consists of the things that we educate ourselves in out of our own interests as individuals, intrinsic motivation, to use a term that's somewhat in vogue in education still, I suppose. And so that's one way to think about what we're doing here, right? As students, right? Not just in the university, but life in general, right? What are those things that we do because we have to do them? What are those things we do because we want to do them, because they somehow feel fulfilling?
Say something about, so what we don't know that we don't know type stuff. I think one of the key steps in the journey of education is being able to tell that for yourself. Being able to reflect back on your knowledge and seeing, okay, have I done things correctly? Do I know what I did was the right thing? And then also being able to say, okay, what's next? And why is that the right step to take for me? And those types of things require a broad experience to sort of develop. And I think that's kind of a key step, knowing what you don't know and knowing why you don't know it and knowing just that sort of thing.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to add? Okay. So that was awesome. I'm going to skip to different questions because I'm not going to get through all these. So to preface, this next question came from a student that's a graduate student in history. So if that helps with this question at all, but he asks, in what ways is education different from brainwashing?
I would just say intent. Hopefully, in education is a positive intent of, I do believe that the overwhelming majority of teachers, and I do believe the teachers I work with in public schools were really good people and wanted to do well. And even though you had to get those kids, especially those little kids, to go along, that's kind of what brainwash is, going along, I guess you could say, in a very basic way. You had to get them to go along with the classroom rules and the behaviors, or there's consequences like a detention or a loss of recess. Normally when you get the term brainwash, you think of a negative intent, and not bringing the horror movies or spy stuff or anything like that. But the intent is not anything positive. What I think is in education, they overwhelming 99.9% of the time, you have teachers that say, so you have to go along with the classroom expectations and things like that, so the teacher can hopefully give you the knowledge and skills that they truly want you to have, because they want you to be successful, whether that's going from kindergarten to first grade, or from algebra 1, algebra 2, or just getting out into the world, wherever that may be. So my view is it's yes, you're, I guess to a extent, you're brainwashed because you have to get them to go along. And as the parent of a kindergartner, I can tell you, get them to go along isn't easy at all. It's the hardest thing ever. But you do it again with good intent, because it's like, well, school starts in 10 minutes, and so we have to go, and so you have to get them to go along. And so I think just until you're doing it for, again, 90% of the time, because you want them to be successful and not have consequences, not have a bad day, not be upset, and be successful, and whatever those education goals are.
This feels very much like the education for slavery versus the education for freedom. There is a big difference there. And it's not just the training versus the sort of growth. That is a lot of it. There's some exploitiveness about one of them, and there's some sort of a empowerment about the other. I think those would probably be the intent again is to be the right difference.
To me, I think there's two things implied by that phrase brainwashing. One is you haven't arrived at whatever you've arrived at by yourself. You haven't done it on your own. It's somebody else has brought you there. So there's this element of just simply being gullible, you know. And part of that then is you haven't yet learned how to figure things out on your own. You don't know how to do that in a certain situation. But the other implication of being brainwashed is whatever you've been told just isn't true. Now, that may not be the case, but you know, I suppose, I don't know. Does it make sense to say someone was brainwashed into the truth? I don't think so. I think it almost always implies that what you've been told is somehow either false or perverted or not the whole truth or something like that. So I think in order to not be brainwashed or not be susceptible to brainwashing, you've got to be able to find things out on your own, and you got to have some way of determining whether that's true or false, whatever it is you're being told. And it has some implications for, you know, teaching as well, because I think a teacher that's not interested in brainwashing you would probably ask more questions than give answers, and lead you to a place where you could just give you an opportunity to find things out, to discover something for yourself. Yeah, brainwashing we often associate with, you know, cults and things like that, or indoctrinations in autocratic countries and so on. And I think that's exactly what gets squelched. You ask a question, you know, you'll get hurt somehow, kicked out or something worse, right? So, I mean, those are the things that just come to my mind as you ask that question.
I think that's an interesting question. And part of it is because I tend to be an optimist, and I tend to trust people and believe that, to your point, the intent is positive. But something that's really kind of actually concerns me a little bit, I almost wonder if we're not in a brainwashed society because of social media, because of our phones and influencers. You see influencers having a big impact on our young people in particular, because I would bet every young person here has their phone and probably looked at it before they walked into the room, and will look at it as soon as they leave. And so they have influencers coming into their minds and their lives almost instantaneously. And again, that takes us back to our original question, why education is so critically important, is because as our young people grow and develop, they have to be able to interpret what is accurate and what's an influencer. And we have people, and this is to me just amazing, we have people that are influencers on some of these social media platforms that are making hundreds of thousands, if not more, dollars. Again, I almost worry that we're in a clickbait society where the goal of a lot of people is to get likes on their social media. And again, part of that is because you almost get your feeling of self-worth from getting those likes and those clicks. And yeah, that's almost coming in. But then when I look at education, I almost think as we develop critical thinkers, we're actually arming our young people to be able to interpret and understand it and take that forward. And so I think that is a concerning thing. And I don't know, maybe for education or educators, but we have to arm our people so that they can handle that stuff. I look at mental health for young people, and I think a lot of the mental health issues for young people is caused by their darn phones. I know again, as a former school administrator, we work a lot with the whole bullying issue and working with parents on how do we deal with that. And a lot of times we would say, well, we'd get, boy, you're not dealing with that at school. And we couldn't control the phones. And we would get, okay, why in the world aren't you taking care of the phone? Well, we can't control what happens after the day when they're home. Young people are on their phones in the middle of the night. And boy, that just concerns me. So back to the brainwashing question, I think that's interesting. Again, I'm an optimist. I would go with Brian that the intent is a big part of that. But arming our young people with the ability to interpret and understand and make their own decisions to what Brian or to Derek said down at the end, be able to make those decisions as they move forward. Now, I think it's age appropriate. And again, my public school background starts really early, 3, 4, 5 years old. And so I think as we work up as they get older and arm those with those skills, I think that's really important.
I was just, when you said the question, it was kind of like, I was wondering if the person was thinking that sometimes education feels like brainwashing. And in some ways, I wonder though, because to me, when you said it, the first thing that came to mind was that it's kind of the difference in education of like an education that's kind of structured to tell people what to think versus what we've been talking about here is this value of critical thinking and learning how to think, learning how to analyze arguments, learning how to analyze data, things like that. So that to some extent, people like to be brainwashed. Maybe this is part of why the social media is somewhat of a problem. People like to be told what to think sometimes. I encounter this with students when you're like, you've got this problem and I want them to analyze the problem and then try to work their way towards a solution. Well, it's just a lot easier for them to say, and I have this happen all the time, and I'll tell students, I say, well, what do you think? And try to ask them questions and get them to come. But a lot of times students will sometimes, come to me, or sometimes students will come and they'll ask, well, I don't even know how to start on this. And just tell me how to answer the problem or tell me how to solve the problem. And I think to some extent, there's a little bit of guilt on both sides. Sometimes educators can be like, okay, well, I've got an agenda. I want people to think this way. And that's kind of what I think of when you think of brainwashing is like, okay, here's the set of things that you need to believe this. And if you don't, you're either dumb, stupid, bad, or something like that. And I think that ideological presuppositions sometimes, or ideological, it's different. I guess that's kind of where I'm thinking of the question is coming from. Maybe like, well, we've got brainwashing going on in our classroom because these people are telling us, this is things are this way or so forth. And I could sense how there could be a concern for that. But what I feel like what we talked about at the beginning is sort of like this, the solution to brainwashing. Because I mean, even if someone wants to be brainwashed, we shouldn't brainwash them. It's not the purpose of education, right? To have some kind of agenda that we're trying to like convince people, okay, this is the way you're supposed to think, but more encourage them to of how to think rather than necessarily what to think. And I say this coming from science, where that's a lot of our education is, okay, these are the things that we want to teach you to know. But even there, we're fallible. I mean, and I'll tell my students, I say, well, this is our best understanding of this at this time. But just because it's science doesn't mean that this won't change or we won't have a different understanding at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think Dr. Kovacs, is it?
Yes.
I think you nailed it there in terms of like the potential motivation for this question. I mean, because when we think about brainwashing in the strict sense, right, it's a set of psychological techniques or even physical torture techniques designed to break down the ego and render an individual open to suggestion and manipulation. When we think about education, I think most of us don't think that's what we're doing in the classroom. Right?
Don't ask them. They would tell you it's
however, right, there is a certain experience of alienation and compulsion, right? Like this is due tomorrow, right? That exists, right? And so, it renders the comparison possible. But there is an ideological content to education, right? It's something that we can identify and analyze, right? There is this cultural war discourse, right? It seems to accrue more to the humanities and the liberal arts, right? Fields in which there is perceived to be, I think incorrectly, a major element of subjectivity, right? This is just a matter of opinion and so forth. You don't have someone coming and saying, Dr. Boeckner, I don't think that square roots are real. You're never going to convince me that that's a thing, right? That just doesn't happen, right? However, it does happen to those of us who teach in the humanities disciplines, right? When we talk about certain subjects. So yeah, you know, that's potential motivation there, I think, behind the question. And it's worthwhile thinking about those things. Like, why is it that my field or Dr. Rozema's field, for instance, right, is subject to that kind of scrutiny and the sort of pre-arming that occurs? There's a certain kind of student who arrives at university having been told their entire life that those professors are going to try to get you to change your fundamental beliefs, right? And so they come into a university setting already with an anti-educational mindset, right? If by education we consider a process of change, right? Of discovery, right? They're not open to that, right? Because they think that their professors, they think that Dr. Rozema is trying to manipulate them somehow, right? And so we should ask why this occurs.
So one thing that I was thinking about through this discussion is, we said earlier that education is giving students the ability to think, just can think, right? But I think it has to be more than that. I think it has to be, it instills the ability and the desire to think. And that's maybe part of the difference between the brainwashing, where you're just told to think this thing and not for yourself. And you have to be able to think about what it is you're being taught. So there's a reflective part to it.
Yeah, this discussion, actually, this term has come up several times, ideology, and we actually talked about this. You guys were talking about this in class today, right? It's just amazing to me that it comes up here again. A lot of times in that term, and ideology is used with a bad connotation to it, right? If you're stuck in an ideology that's considered to be similar to being brainwashed. But what we talked about today seems relevant to me. The difference between following the truth and an ideology is, an ideology is when you worship something almost as if it's a godlike thing, and you're not open to discussing it, to opposing views or anything like that. And so you're kind of locked into that, but it's not God that you're worshiping, it's an idea. Okay. And so you're gonna be liable to being manipulated by whoever is propounding that ideology. So I think there is a difference between an ideology and what we might say is the truth. Now, we don't always know the truth, but to find it when we don't know it means you've got to be open to considering other questions about it that if you're just following an ideology, you may think those questions have been answered and we don't need to discuss this anymore. You really see that kind of an attitude in some of the characters in Solzhenitsyn's works, where he's talking about those who have been, if I can use that term, sort of indoctrinated into a system that they don't dare question, and they've never been taught how to do that either, or encouraged to. So anyway, that connection just, that's the only reason I said it, because we talked about it today in class. It's good.
Part of me kind of wonders, and I've been listening to all this great stuff, and it just made a few more thoughts pop up. We all kind of know the history of the public schools. Some of the schools that you see now look very similar to schools from 100 years ago. The desk in rows, worksheets, answering questions. You raise your hand to go to the bathroom. You raise your hand if you need water. All those things, and then there's like no movement. You kind of, you see those shows and everything. Where that's maybe how you went to school, and that seems a lot like brainwashing. And very, pretty straight out on there. And we're hopefully starting to, and some of the research I've done, some things I try to talk to my students about is not having those classrooms where the students move, they collaborate, they work together, which is somewhat the opposite of that. And then in the inner workings of the schools, which we all know about, is then of course, how we have that unfortunately, is you do have all the standardized testing, which kind of feeds right back into sit down in the rows and practice these rote skills, because the school needs you to pass so we get our funding. So you got these two things, what's better for the student versus what's better for the school, kind of competing, things about that. And I'm so glad everybody's talking about critical thinking. And I know you kind of mentioned that discerning the right information from the wrong information. Since we're in a very small research project about a year ago, doing a little bit of research about the skills students need when they join secondary education or the workforce, like when they leave high school. And almost every article I found talked about critical thinking and, identifying the veracity or the, is discerning fake news from real news. Not trying to use the fake news for political terms. I don't like to do that. But just because it's on social media doesn't mean it's true. And helping students understand that. And that was the reason I broke a lot of fights my last year of teaching, was because of nonsense on social media. So very, very powerful in our schools.
Favorite thoughts? All right. The way the time is looking, this is the last question I'll ask you before opening up Q&A with the audience. Should all students be held to the same standard, even when intelligence and ability vary? Could this be detrimental for potentially higher achieving students who may not feel challenged? Any thoughts that come to mind for that?
Can I ask for clarification? Standards in what? What they know, what they can do, what standards you have?
I'm pretty sure this was another individual's question. I think it has to do primarily with the difficulty of the class, but like what the how much content the students are expected to know or comprehend or on that one.
I can start. That's a good question, because you're going to see arguments and debates on all sorts of the issue. Part of that is depending upon perspective of the individual, their parents, the people involved. Perspective is a big thing. It's just critically important for educators to try to meet the children where they're at and help them to get farther than we can expect. I've mentioned that before. And so the question with that is, what does that look like if you are at the top, if you're at the middle, or if you struggle in that particular area? I think a critical point is sometimes we tend to pigeonhole a child, or honestly a young adult learner, in a particular category and assume that's where they're going to fall in all different areas. You look at in a lot of school districts working on high ability learner, gifted education, and some of those types of things. Sometimes the students that don't necessarily fit in our box and are excellent reader or a good math student or some of those types of things, we don't assume that they're high ability or gifted because they don't fit in that box. But you can have an incredibly talented musician or an incredibly talented artist that are incredibly gifted. Actually, I was talking to someone today I remember one of my first classes at Kearney State at the time, when I wanted to be an architect and the whole drawing thing. I had a classmate that when they had to demonstrate what they could do, they drew a mountain lion on a mountain with a stream and trees and birds. And it was like to me, wow, how in the world did he do that? Because I was a math person. That was my thing. I was probably gifted in that area. And so sometimes as we look at those children, we have to figure out, where are they gifted? Because I think all people have gifts, and compared to those that are struggling in some areas. The challenge we have in our schools, because of funding and because of numbers and because of class size and those types of things, it's really hard to individualize those students, and individualize those lessons for those students. Now, if you break it down even in more depth and look at individual standards, I think we look at each child and say, can this particular essential skill, where do you fit? And ask the questions. What do they need to know? How do we know when they know? What do we do if they already know? And what do we do if they don't know? And if we use that model to approach our education, then we can meet each child where they're at on that particular skill, help them move forward, but not pigeonhole them in the old, some of you would remember this, the bluebirds and the blackbirds, and you put them in a group and that's where they were for life. And I think we missed the boat with that. So they'll try to customize and meet those children where they're at and help them get to the next point.
So this makes me think of the question of the grades, in the sense that they're looking for standards. And that's, to me, not at all the goal of education. The student themselves to me, the goal is to get them to understand when they don't need to be the student anymore. Right. And so when they're setting themselves behind standards, they're kind of missing the point in education, at least in my opinion. I understand from administrative points of view that these things are necessary. In an ideal world, to me, I don't think I would like them, but we don't live in that world.
For me, it's a very pragmatic and less philosophical question. As someone who teaches in modern languages, administers modern languages programs, we are obligated to do a lot of individuation and consideration of different levels, different speeds at which students acquire languages. So for instance, we have placement procedures that put students at their approximate level in terms of our curriculum, right? You know, we may start them in second-year classes or even third-year classes, depending on their proficiency. However, you know, within a single class, I may have a student, let's say 2 students. They all complete the same assignments. They all do them more or less equally well in terms of fulfilling the requirements of the assignment, turning it in on time, and so forth. But at the end of the semester, when I look at those 2 students, I can see that one has progressed beyond the other, right? Do I penalize the one who hasn't progressed as much? No, I really can't, right? Because their progression is a function of not just what they do in the class, but also other circumstances like innate ability, aptitude, family circumstances, which were mentioned, just sort of general academic preparedness. I don't have control over that, and really the student doesn't either. That said, you know, there are benchmarks and standards that we sort of apply to ourselves as a department and by proxy to the students, right? When students graduate, we want them at a certain level and we hold ourselves to that, right? And we're pretty successful in getting students up to that level, regardless of where they start. So I think there needs to be a combination of the both things, right? There need to be objective standards that exist, right? I mean, I can't tell a student they're at advanced low, right? And send them on an exchange program to Germany, right? If they're actually at intermediate level, right? It would be a total disaster, right? So there are objective standards, but at the same time, you know, individuals progress at different rates in all sorts of areas of life and education.
Yeah, well, just looking at the grammar of the term, you can't evaluate if you don't have standards. It's impossible. Reminds me of what one of my colleagues once said when we were on a search committee together, Tom Martin, and we were told by a university officer that we weren't allowed to discriminate. And Tom came right back and said, "Then how can we decide?" Well, he's right. And there has to be some way. I know what they meant. You're not supposed to discriminate according to race or gender or any of those things, but it's a good point, right? You can't evaluate if you don't have some standards. It makes no sense to say you made an evaluation if you don't have some kind of a standard. That being said, the reason I asked the clarifying question was because the standard is going to depend on what it is that you're grading. Is it how much information they've retained? Is it how well they can work a math problem? Is it whether they can give a cogent argument? Is it even, and sometimes I have portions in my class, portion of their grade is, I tell them it's an effort grade. I want to know if you're trying. And if you are, then you're going to get credit. Because I know there are some students that are just naturally brighter than others, and they don't have to try as hard. But I want to give credit to the people that are working. You know, they go to the library every day, they study for 2 hours, they work on it. They come to me and talk about problems they're having. That means something to me, and it shows me something about their character. And so even if their ability to do something is lesser than somebody else's, at least I have a portion of the grade where I can say, look, you get credit for being a diligent student. But then you also have, what it is you're trying to teach them, and you have to have ways of being able to tell. For example, so a student comes and says, I don't know why I got the C on this exam. And I can be able to say to them, not just say me telling them how they might improve, but here's an A student. Look at what they've done and how they've done it. And you make the comparison and you can see the kinds of things that, the ways you can improve. And then in connection with John's question, I'm not going to grade somebody on something over which they have no control. But, standards depend on what it is that you're looking at. And I think standards, for example, in my classes, you're required to attend. That's pretty low standard, you just have to come. That counts for a little, but that's not going to get you an A in class, so I have to look for other things as well. That's about the best I can do with that question.
But being in education as well, obviously everybody's made great points on a lot of what I would have said. It would just sound like I was repeating Mike, because he had, I think, over 30 years in the public schools. I had 15, so a lot of similar thoughts. But I try to, and this I have a witness to a test that I talked about this in my class. Is so long as the standard you're holding your students to is a high standard, it doesn't have to be the same standard. Students have different ability levels, and we have in our public schools been very guilty of teaching to the middle, and most of the kids live in the middle. I was right there too, so I can attest to that too. And so that's why teachers teach the middle, because that's where most of the students are. And so we have to find ways to help the students who are not in the middle. And one way that you help the students who are above the middle is you don't just tell them to go read a book when they're done, because some students will do that. To your high achieving students, maybe the very good students, most often, you say, okay, you're done, go read a book, go do whatever, and they're okay, because that's what they do. My daughter, for example, you tell her to go sit and read a book, but she's done with the math, she'll do it, because that's what she does. But you need to find ways to say, okay, how can we help you find creative ways to expand your own knowledge? Because if that worksheet or that activity, and hopefully it's not just worksheets, didn't really challenge that student, and we're wasting their time, whether they're a second grader or 12th grader, how can we find ways to use, whether it's technology assisted or some way to create where they're not just answering our questions, but they're creating their own questions to, I always tell my students, when you set the minimum, the worksheet, the activity, the test, you also set the maximum. Maybe students say, if you tell your students, write at least 3 paragraphs, you're going to get 3 paragraphs from everybody, right? The minimum becomes the maximum. So you find a way to take that away from those higher achieving students. You'll let their creativity and their intellect, their gifts take over. And I said in my class is a technology class, a social technology class. We talk about ways they can use technology to do that. There's a lot of great non-technology ways to do that too. It can be just about anything. With your students who are below the middle, you still have to hold them to a high standard, but maybe you just help them show their ability differently. And so I talk to my students about video-based responses, alternative assessments. You don't have to use multiple choice, solve this word problem to see what they know. You can have students draw their answers, comic strips and books and movies and plays that show what they know. I learned that being a foreign language teacher myself, where they could show, because they had to show their spoken ability. And you can't show your spoken ability on a multiple choice test. Kind of obvious, I know. But that kind of helped me learn how you can help students reach a high standard without being a standardized test. Does that make sense? And so everything else that Mike said, I would have said, but I'll let him go first. I don't want to be the first one to talk on that question. So. And he's smart about it.
I have a lot of other questions that were a little bit more distinct and more played out than that one. But I'm just going to call it good for the things that I had to start this off, so there's just information out on the playing field for everyone. And so anyone in the audience, if any of you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
I have a question.
So a couple of months ago, there was a bill, I don't know where, what it was called, but it would have given parents the power to, if they didn't like something that was being taught in a high school classroom, they could stop that and take that out of the curriculum. Obviously, it's going to go both ways. You're never going to please anybody. There's going to be parents that want something kept in, and other parents want taken out. So I guess my question is, do you think parents should have the power to influence education in that way, to change it just because they don't like what's being taught?
So these are public schools, right?
Yeah.
And so most of these places have school boards. So they do have an influence there. I don't know how much of an influence they need, but they do have a vested interest in their children. But they also need to support their children themselves. This is a tough question, but depending on the issues, I would feel like the instructors have areas of expertise. The parent should kind of rely on some of that. They should have discussions with those instructors and see why those things are in the curriculum. And the school boards should have those voices heard. I don't think they need to be completely excluded, but I don't think they need to also dictate exactly what goes on in the classroom. If they want to do that, they can teach the kids themselves, right?
Even to teach the kids themselves. I mean, it's an established principle that the government, state, right, has an interest in educational outcomes, right, in terms of producing an educated population and citizenry and so forth. So even homeschool regulations tell parents the subjects that they have to cover. They can't just teach, I don't know, the Bible or the Torah or whatever, right? Like there are certain areas that they have to cover. Now there's very little oversight in a lot of instances, but there is that idea out there, right? And so the state has already sort of established or claimed, right, that it has the right to intervene in education for the benefit of everyone, right, for democracy, what have you, right? And so the parents' rights are limited in that sense, right? And they're not supposed to be allowed to constrain, you know, what their children learn. Right? They don't own their kids, right? They don't necessarily have the right as parents to tell their children how to think, right? But it shouldn't, right? Because the children are going to become independent humans at some point, presumably, right? And so they need to have some autonomy there, right? And a good parent, in my view, would cultivate that autonomy so their child can succeed, right? Once they leave home, go to college, enter the workforce, and so forth, right? And these seem to be pretty commonsensical things, right? So what you're describing really is a concerted effort across numerous states to exercise direct ideological control, not just of like homeschooling, right, but also of public schooling. As Derek mentioned, right, this is a problem, right, because the parents aren't necessarily experts in all subjects, right? Parent can't necessarily teach world history at home if they've never studied the subject, right? They have to rely on people who have studied and become experts, right? If education is going to be meaningful and rigorous and have standards, right? If we're going to address the other question again. Some ideas.
I would assume, and no offense to the book, that they're not targeting algebra or biology. Because if they were, I might, no offense, support those, because when my kids get older, I will not be able to help them. So they'd have to take it, it'd be easier for me. But that's probably not what we're getting at. It's more the cultural aspect that has gripped the country currently, and will probably be there through the next midterm election, the next presidential election. Then they'll move on to something else, and that has seemed to be the case. So it tends to be the anti-bullying, those type of things that people want to attack. And because I don't think you're going to just say no more algebra, don't teach algebra. And you can't tell people how to feel in their home, but it's the same people, in my opinion, and I probably shouldn't say this anyway, it's the same people who are opposed, I'm just going to say anti-bullying, there's other things too, that are opposed to anti-bullying, they say, we should take care of that in our homes. There's a good chance they aren't, because they're the ones that seem to want to cry the loudest, and the parents, not the kids, who seem to want to cry the loudest and push everybody around to get what they want and kind of be a bully themselves to get the anti-bullying, for instance, out of the school. And I don't want to say too, I'd get myself in trouble or anything like that, but that seems to be the case. It's more those types of issues, not academic issues, it's more the social emotional health issues that for whatever reason are scary to people, which I don't understand. But and that's where it's dangerous, because you're robbing students of the chance to become better people.
At the risk of sounding like a circular answer, I would say you should pay more attention to the parents who can tell you why than you should to those that just say, well, I just don't like it. Because you're relying on, you're asking them to exhibit their own education by asking them that kind of question. And in fact, I think you can do it in such a way that you're inviting them to do that. You're inviting them to enter into a rational discussion about something, which is really one of the things we want to model for our students, So, some parents you should pay more attention to than others. The ones you should pay more attention to are the ones that can give a rationale for why they think what they think, that are willing to listen to you in return, willing to have a conversation about that, and are both, and I think this is key, you have to have both sides of this really interested in finding an answer rather than just winning the argument.
Yeah, all I was going to say was this, that I think, definitely parents should have a say in their children's education. Anybody who's a parent and cares about, it's an important thing to care about your child's education. As a matter of fact, most children are going to learn probably a lot, most from their parents, especially in terms of character development and things like that. And, this idea of education is a professional thing that can only be done by the professionals. I don't think that's what we're saying up here. I think that it's a partnership. I like what Dave said about, ideas do matter, but at the same time, it has to be kind of a give and take when you get in, because basically this came up over the last year, right? Where some person who actually didn't win the election made the statement, and it is believed to have cost him at least some votes. Well, parents don't have no right to dictate, or to have any say about. This is the way some people perceived it, was that there was this idea, and it definitely should not be an idea that we have as educators, that parents have no right to have a say in what is done in education. I think they have right. It doesn't mean they have an exclusive right to say what gets taught in the school exclusively, but it should be a dialogue rather than, like trying to win an argument kind of thing. It should be, but I could see why, as a parent, I can see why parents would be sensitive about that. And so I think that it's definitely something that educators need to be careful not to come off as, well, I'm the expert. I know, this subject perfectly, and you, there's nothing you can really tell me about it or ask me about it or anything like that. I do think we have to be careful not to, make it worse by communicating it poorly. I think what Dave said is good, to try to engage in a way that's positive and constructive and models dialogue, because that, I think, is one of the things that we really struggle with, especially in our current cultural moment. Is it's very difficult for us to, it seems like it's very difficult for us to have dialogue. And in part, I think it's because we don't listen to what other people are saying. We say what we want to say, and then already we're thinking about, well, how am I going to answer that without actually listening to what's being said? And I think the same courtesy should be given to parents when they're, raising issues or questions.
So I love your question, and I think it's the $1 million question. I mean, my world is something we dealt with all the time as a school administrator. And a lot of it, and I would agree, I think that parents are the first teachers. And you think about it, they're with the schools for 6 hours a day, and they're with their parents the rest of the time. And the parents have to be the first teacher. The challenge from a school district's perspective is that's based upon a continuum. There are some things, as mentioned down here, that are standards that have to be addressed. I mean, no one's going to challenge that we're teaching addition and subtraction. I mean, they're not. That's on the continuum. Say, well, that's where we're at. However, on the other end of the continuum, there are things that parents should have input and should be able to decide. So, as school districts, as school officials, we have to decide where that continuum is. All school districts, at least in Nebraska, have a complaint process. As was mentioned down here, the school board, the local school board makes that decision. Even when standards are adopted at the state and the national level, school boards have the ability to decide how that applies to their own particular district. Some standards are required. However, as a school district, you're able to decide how you're going to apply those standards across all levels. Some standards are proposed or suggested that may or may not be adopted in the local school district because locally elected board members make those decisions. Now, again, parents have to have the ability to hear what's going on, and as someone needs to be willing to sit down and talk to them about that and provide access to that information. Now, most school districts also have an ability for a parent to opt out of a presentation or some of those types of things if they feel that's an area in which they don't want their child exposed. However, there's a continuum in there. Some things are non-negotiable that all children have to learn and to address and some of those types of things. And some are negotiable. And again, I think it's going to look different wherever you're at. I talk about being adaptable. That's going to look different in Mullen, Nebraska and Lincoln. It's going to look different in Kearney and South Sioux City. And so I think that, again, that's just so important that we think, what's that continuum? Communicate with your parents. Make sure you give them the opportunity. I'm going to go back to math because we keep saying math is not controversial. There are some math curriculums that are different than others. There's a current math curriculum that's being adopted in a lot of schools that puts a lot more pressure on the students to learn and think instead of regurgitate and rote memory. And so for some parents, that's hard. As Brian mentioned, if I'm that parent, I don't know if I can help my kid with that. And eventually I have to turn it over to the experts to get there. I guess the example I would use, when I go to the doctor, I have some input, but eventually I have to rely on their expertise to make me help. I hurt my shoulder over the Christmas break. They're working to fix me. I go to physical therapy. I make decisions on, well, yeah, I agree with what he's doing, and I'm going to. And so I think that continuing thinking about that, giving those parents that opportunity to voice their opinion and communicate with them so they know what's going on. A lot of it, again, I go back to social media. Maybe I'm anti-social media, but a lot of what they think is what they hear on or see on their phone. And parents are similar to our youth. They make the decisions based upon what they see on their phone. And often with the political chaos that we're in currently in our country, it's pretty easy to be pulled one way or the other, and the dialogue stops. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you.
I have kind of a question of my own about this, because, this discussion so far about this question has primarily been focused on the K-12 environment, right? And so there seems to be some openness to the idea that parents have a vested interest in their child's education and that they should have input and so forth. I don't disagree with that. However, what we're talking about here is the parent's ability to apply restrictions on what is taught, in some cases how it's taught in the K through 12 school system. Now, as professors, I'm curious as what level of parental intervention you would tolerate in your classrooms in terms of a parent coming to you and saying, you know what, Mr. Psychology Professor, I don't really think you should cover for it because the guy was a cocaine user and that's a bad influence on my kid. Or, I don't really think you should cover these topics in biology because, I'm subscribing to the theory that the dinosaur fossils are fake and they were buried in the ground in this vast conspiracy. So to what, I mean, these are extreme examples, but to what point would you accept parental intervention in your curricula in the classrooms in higher education?
None. Parents and everyone that's in my classroom is at least very close to age of majority, according to the state. And they can make their own decisions at this point of what they decide to learn. They can do that by going to my class or going to somebody else's class. And so I don't think the parents have that right at this level.
Simply due to the age of the student?
Most, yeah.
Well, and furthermore, most of our, I don't think none of our classes are compulsory.
Right.
So students don't have to take, I mean, they might have to take English 102, but they've got multiple people they can choose from in sections.
Define have to take. Do they want a job?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to get a university education. It's not required. Right? That's why you pay for it. So, yeah, I kind of agree with Derek. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't listen to a parent or to a student who came in and said, I've got an objection to this, or I have a question about this. I'm willing to talk to anybody. Let's work it through. Let's find out if your complaint or your concern is reasonable or not. And if they're willing to do that, then, you know, I'll listen.
That discussion that can happen. We talked about it's an important discussion at the secondary and the primary level. So we should also be willing to have that. But our expertise at this level should probably be able to persuade whoever we're talking to that our curriculum is the correct curriculum.
And sometimes complaints that people have are just based on something that's patently false. Or at that point, you just have to say, no, you're just wrong about that.
Yeah. So Derek,
yes,
I liked your analogy about being a well-rounded person, being able to roll into different kinds of thinking. That would be one of the ways that you can need this. In order to do that, it seems to me, going on your last comment, that there are things that we should force the students to take, whether they like them or not.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that.
Well, your example was you could drop the biology course.
Right.
Right. Okay. But it seems to me that we should force them to take some things that they feel uncomfortable with, and maybe even some things they don't feel they can do very well, and maybe they're right about that. But as part of being a well-rounded person, don't you have to try to get some of this? Otherwise, there's going to be places where you can't roll to.
So the student that wants that well-rounded education should seek that.
Yes, well, isn't that what a university
tries to provide or tries to instill? Yeah. Ergo a general studies curriculum.
Which requires things like a year of math, a year of actually doing science in a lab. Because otherwise you don't know how people think when they're doing science. You just memorized a bunch of
facts.
Well, brainwashing stuff. About dangerous weather and stuff. So that's what we should really be about.
You're the spokesperson. You get to pick people.
A couple of hands here.
Which one did you guys see first?
I saw him because he's in front of me.
Yeah, so.
She can go ahead.
So I was an educator at a community college last year. One of the biggest struggles I had was motivating students to want to learn and not just to get a degree. So what are some things you do to help a student want to learn and not just get a grade?
you have that conversation with them. I've had the uncomfortable conversation with students that have come to my office and in tears or frustrated with the grade that they're getting. And I have to talk about, okay, grades aren't everything. Once you get out of here and you get your first job, nobody's ever going to look at your degree again. They're just going to say that you got it checked off. And those conversations aren't necessarily easy, and that convincing isn't necessarily easy, but you have to get them to look beyond those initial things that they've been trained to think about since kindergarten. They've been trained that, okay, to move on, I got to get this A. To meet these standards, I have to do these things. And at the college level, those discussions need to start happening. And that transformation needs to start happening. It should probably start earlier. But with the focus on the mandatory education and those sorts of things, it's hard to get them started at those other levels.
I don't know that I can answer your question. I'm pretty sure I can't answer your question. But if you bring up something I've noticed, like most people, I teach some undergraduate and some graduate courses, a pretty common split. My undergraduates, they're 19, 20 years old when they come to class. Of course, they want to do well, and I want them to do well. And so the grades tend to be pretty solid. But they're generally, with a few exceptions, tends to be a general curiosity. They want to do well because they're pre-service teachers. Most of them want to be teachers. They're excited. They want to do right by their future students. They want to just learn new things. And I try to help them understand what my teaching might be like, and not being like a horror story, but I try to be honest. And but then like with my graduate students who are all online, they'll just give me the A or you're in trouble. I'm just like, I have to get a 4.0. I'm like, why? I didn't do anything wrong because you didn't get a 4.0. Again, I don't know if it happens when you just enter the working world or what it is, but it seems like the 4.0 is almost more important. Like once you start getting the paycheck, then when it makes it so that youth enthusiasm. I don't know what it is, but your comment kind of brought that up to me, and maybe one of these, maybe you would probably be the best answer for that one. I don't know. Certainly not me, but they kind of brought that up. I would throw it out there. Maybe that sparks something else. I don't know.
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a solvable problem, right? This issue of motivation, right? Because you're always going to have, that subset of students that are internally motivated because they're interested in the subject and they're just there because they love it, right? But that doesn't describe the majority of our students, as my colleagues can attest, especially in some of our classes, because there's a lot of students who are simply externally motivated, right? We go back to this idea of compulsion, right? We have compulsory education K through 12. But higher education is also compulsory in the sense that, well, if you're a working class student, right, you feel like you have to go to college in order to transcend the economic circumstances into which you were born, right? You have to roll the dice. You have to take on a whole bunch of debt unless you're fortunate enough to get scholarships and so forth, right? Not the majority, right? You have to roll the dice. You have to enter the casino and hope that you come out, right, with a result, right, that allows you to be economically viable in a way that you wouldn't have been otherwise without attending college, right? If you're a middle class student, right, you still feel compelled, right, because you want to resist the downward mobility, right, that is potentially there. If you don't go to college, right, you have to live up to social expectations, your family and friends going to college, telling you that you should go to college and so forth, right? So it's not a complete realm of freedom, right, to return to that idea here in higher education. And so you're never going to solve the problem of that purely external motivation, right, which is not really a motivated student, right, unless you sort of open up that realm of freedom, right, and make it really a personal choice to study different areas, to go to college, right? Because for most people, it's not a choice. It's do it or die.
I would agree with John that it's, in a sense, it's not solvable. In other words, there's no guarantee that you're ever going to succeed with every student. But I think there are things you could try. I think you have to be like you want your student to be. And they have to see that. I love this stuff. This just really gets me going. Or this is important. And I'm going to make a pitch here, okay? I just don't think you can do that online. You can't look a student in the face and say, what do you think of that? What about this idea? You can't look at them and say, look, do you know what you just read? Do you get that? And look them in the eye and see if there is a spark there. At least in philosophy, you can't do that. I don't think you could in any of the humanities, honestly. So I think in-person teaching, to get them motivated, you have to be motivated. You have to be the student you want them to be. And I also think that there are techniques you can try if it's not ever going to, you know, this is the creativity of a teacher. You have to try to figure these things out. But I think, at least in our classes, I think Gene and others would agree with me, you have to find a hook question, something that you can say it in just a way that they go, oh, I've never thought of that before. That's a good question. Or some analogy that just really captures their imagination. So like I said, there's no guarantee, but I think there are things you could try. I think it's the sort of thing teachers, if they're conscientious teachers, they get better at it the longer they do it. I think the poorer the teachers are the ones that just don't try to do that anymore. I think we all know that. Those are the teachers. So that's, I guess, the best answer I can give.
What did you teach, by the way?
Construction technology. It's a little different from liberal arts. Most of them wanted to be there, but not all of them,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
Well, mine's actually a good follow-up question to that because some of the answers to the previous question already touched on this. But mine is about how can we cultivate a healthy attitude towards success and failure in education? Because it's important that we praise success and we discourage failure. That's an important distinction that we need to teach people. But like as we grow older and face real life, we know that it's not that simple, right? So sometimes you can succeed just because it was easy and it's not that big a deal. And sometimes failure can be great. Like some of the best lessons I've ever learned in life was horrible failures in my life. So how do we help instill that in people as they grow?
If it's okay, I'll jump real quick. Just, I think Monday, I recorded a presentation for a small conference and about a different teaching pedagogy that is kind of catching, ground the last little bit. And we talked about a little bit about how in this one pedagogy, it's called design thinking. If the teacher sets up with the proper culture and support encouragement, where the students come up with their own solutions and they prototype and they test them, that sometimes those prototypes will fail. And so when the students are in the right situation, when the students are being laughed at, et cetera, they can fail forward. Kind of what you're talking about. Yeah, this prototype didn't work. What can I learn from that? So I can go back and try it again and continue to move towards solving this problem. Whether it's a math problem, whether it's any sort of real life scenario the student has been given to solve, so they can build some resiliency. And one of the problems that a lot of teachers, when we talk about this, my co-presenter talked about, was one objection teachers have is a lot of teachers are very big-hearted, very kind-hearted. We love our students very much. And it almost hurts us more than it hurts the students when they fail. So the last thing we want to do is see them fail, but it's actually going to do them a disservice. Because you can't wait till you're 18 years old to fail, because what are you going to do? So you have to learn how to pick yourself up, dust yourself up, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, or in an academic sense, and say, okay, that one didn't work. I have 3 other prototypes that I designed as part of this pedagogy. So I can try this and figure out which one works and get better. So that's, and you do see that you're not seeing that enough, but there are different ideas out there about how you do it. And some school districts, my school district, their big slogan was failing forward. Encouraging to, you're right. And we hate to talk about test scores. Say, hey, you have a 42 to a 45. Let's focus on the 3 that you went up, not the 25, you're still away from a passing score.
Right.
And talk about that, and then building the students up. So that you're right, they're not there yet, but they're growing, they're getting there. And so that help them with some of that resiliency. And that's something that you're not seeing enough, but you do see at times that does offer some hope, and hopefully that helps a little bit of.
Yeah.
So I like the two questions you followed up, because really, if you think about life in general, it all comes down to your why. We have whys for everything that we do. And you think about the number of decisions we make in a day. And so when we take it back to your question on why are some students engaged and why are some students not engaged, and to your question on what determines success, it all comes back to their why. If I teach at the graduate level, and so my people should be fairly motivated, but I believe in a mastery level approach, that when I assign tasks, I will tell them right up front, there's going to be no busy work in my courses. Everything that we do is critical for you to be able to move forward. If you want to take this role in your next part of your career, you have to be able to do these skills. But you have to make that choice. Again, I'm dealing with graduate students, and honestly, graduate school students are even a little bit older. But I've had students where in the school finance class, honestly, my teachers in my school finance class, they take it as the last class of the program. They actually dread being in there. And so we have to establish that hook in advance and let them know you can truly do this. This is not going to be calculus. That's not required. But we're going to set that hook. And then they have to establish their why. And then they determine whether or not they can have success. So if they get to a task and they elect not to complete it at mastery, they either redo it or get no points. Eventually, they have to decide, is this truly something I want to do? Because there is no busy work. And most of them figure it out. Some decide, wow, I don't know if I can do this. And so then again, that whole why comes back to why are they in the program? Some are not in the program to become school administrators. They're in the program for salary advancement because that's how it works. But they're pretty clear, and their work's going to probably maybe be at a different level. You have some that determine success is, I want to be able to do that. Matter of fact, I give them the opportunity to go way deeper. You talk about extending learning for those that already get it. If you already understand this, well, we have opportunities if you go a lot deeper, and then they get to look at all sorts of statistics across all sorts of different school districts and stuff. But until you establish that why, whether that be in construction management or mathematics or chemistry or whatever they happen to be, or if you want to be an elementary teacher, we need you to be the best elementary teacher possible, because kids' lives based upon your ability. So establishing that why and letting them, it's not for everybody.
I guess, okay, I have a 5-year-old son, right? I want him to be able to dunk a basketball.
Already?
Yeah. Kindergarten. I could do it in 9th grade. He should be able to do it in kindergarten, right? Okay. But the point is, like, you can't set someone a task that's like beyond their capability or too far beyond what they are capable of or what they feel they're capable of. So I won't bore you with like the intricacies of task design, right? The good teacher knows how to set that bar, right? We talk about standards, right? I have a goal that I want my student to get to. I can't necessarily ask that of the student right away, you know. We have to go in increments, right? And so success, right, is sort of a shifting goalpost, right? I want them to succeed at this task. Actually, no, I don't. I want them to fail at this task, right? It's just slightly too hard for them, but I want them to be able to identify the element that caused them to fail, right? So they can isolate that and then move beyond that, right? And we do that in increments, right? Until soon, they're doing tasks that were previously impossible, right? So I think, you know, that's sort of part of the teaching profession, part of pedagogy, still to recognize how to set those steps and design tasks that allow productive failure, let's say.
So we've talked about grades a little bit, how grade motivated many students are. And you have to reward the process, not just the success or failure. In math, that's usually pretty easy because we don't just let you plug the question into the calculator and say, yeah, you got it right. So we need to see your work. We need to see how you developed what you know, explain why you know it, and then come up with the correct answer there. And we can get partial credit along the way, which kind of does that. And other areas have their ways to do that too. Dave was talking about effort and rewarding effort earlier, and I think that's very important. But the process has to be the important part. The reasoning skills, the critical thinking that we want to develop needs to be rewarded, not just the success or failure.
I was thinking of that usual response you get, right? When you tell somebody about a terrible failure you had, they'll say, that's okay, builds character, right? Or not. You hear similar expression about learning from experience. My students love to tell me, you know, that's the best kind of education, experience, you know, the world of life, the streets. What do you learn from experience? So you rob a bank and you fail, you get caught. What do you learn from that experience? Well, you could learn not to do that, or you could learn how to do it better. Right? Next time you'll succeed. So there's this thing missing. You know, why do some students get better after a failure? How does, you know, what makes the difference between that person and the one who learns, I'm just not going to try this anymore. I'm not going to do that anymore. Because you can build good character from failure, but you can also learn to be more vicious than you were. I think either are possible. So I'd kind of like to throw this question out to everybody else. What makes the difference between the first student and the second one, or the first person and the second one? What's going to tip the scales one way or the other?
Thoughtful reflection.
Maybe.
Don't we have to reflect on the goodness or badness of the thing being attempted?
You do? Yeah, I think you do. I guess I really think that, I was thinking about my dad, and when I would fail at something, he would, you know, I'd be sympathetic properly and so on, but he would say, try it again. Do it again. Not, you know, Aristotle says that's the beginning of the development of virtue and vice. It's habit. You do it again, do it again, do it again. So to develop this kind of resiliency you're talking about, you have to have a teacher that will say, try it again, do it again. And they'll stick with you on that. They won't at any point say, okay, you know, unless you get it right, then they say, okay, you did it. Of course, even then, like, I think coaches are like this too. So you got it right. Show me that you really did. Do it again. You know? So that's part of the answer, but I really do think that's a real question for all of you out there. What makes the difference between the one that improves from the failure and the one that just says, okay, I'm done with that?
I would think, I like that comment. I think one of the things that's really important is to surround yourself, and students surround themselves with people that lift them up and support them. Here in a couple of weeks, we're doing a presentation on mentoring and mentorship and what that looks like for college students, for young adults, for graduate students, some of those types of things. What I have found is the people that are able to respond to those tough situations, a lot of times have a network of people around them to support them through the failures and help them guide them, whether that be a college professor, whether that be a parent, whether that be a friend, whether it be a minister. There's having that network around you. And back to your resiliency comment, I think some of our challenges for some of our young people is they don't have that network. You know, Coach Osborne with the mentoring program, the Teammates Mentoring Program, had a huge impact in the state where he was just represented or recognized with a national award for mentorship. But it's those, and you can do that too. The interesting part about as college students, you can have a huge impact on younger people because they look at you and go, wow, look at them. And so surrounding yourself with people that can lift you up can get you there. Now, I tell you what, it's hard because it's easy to be drugged down by other things, but that's critically important. Don't be afraid to ask. So I've only been here for like 3 or 4 years. Brian and I came in the same year, and we rely on each other to lift us up because there's negative here within our colleagues and within the people. There's some negative stuff there, but finding that person to help you and guide you and take you to that next level is critically important. If you look back, most of the people in the room didn't get to where we are now without someone saying, hey, you know, we think you can do this. I have a strategy where, and this is, I share this with all my students, but I keep the business card in my wallet with the names of the 5 people that had the biggest influence in my career. Whenever anything happens that's good, wherever I have a challenge, I pull that out and think about, okay, how would they handle this? And then once here, I send them a thank you note. I will tell you, I think 3 of them have passed away, so I've had to add to my list. But that can have a huge impact. It's fun. I have a daughter that's actually, she's a nurse now in Omaha, but she has a young lady that is now in high school in the school where she graduated. That once a year contacts her and says, you know, thank you. I was having a difficult time when I was in middle school and some of the challenges that middle school girls face. And yet you stepped out as a college student, reached out to me and made that connection and helped me get to where I am now. And so part of that resiliency is if we can help people develop that network of people that support them and lift them up. Because again, it's very easy to be brought down. We need to help each other and bring each other up.
Yeah. I guess I'll take a stab at David's question. So I play an e-sport. I won't tell you which one. In fact, I shouldn't admit it at all because you all are philosophers and you're above things like video games. One thing I've noticed is that like the difference between players who just think they're good and actual pro players is a certain openness to external critique and a willingness to make changes based on that feedback. And so I think just in general, true education can only take place when the learner has a certain openness to the world, right? Education can't happen without other people, right? Education can't happen without experience of all sorts of types, but more importantly, a willingness to let that experience, right, let those other people operate a change in ourselves, right? Like if there's resistance to that change, right, there's not going to be growth. That would be my take.
I was going to say something about a little bit of self-confidence, which was something Mike sort of mentioned. That the ability to go back and try again requires a little bit of ego and a little bit of arrogance to say, I can do this. And just that confidence can be instilled by success or repeated success and sort of, okay, you did it, you can do it again from the instructor or from an outside source. You can reinforce that thought process.
Yeah. Any more questions?
I was just wondering if you guys, I'm gonna steal a question. Gene asked somebody the other day, explain what experiential learning is, maybe what it's not, and whether saying what it is, if it really is anything good, or if it's anything different than an experience that a student, I guess an example I have in mind is in my class, we read books together, we talk about them, we write essays on them, and that's an experience that many of my students have not had. So I was wondering if that would count as experiential learning. If not, why? If so, then what does experiential learning or learning look like?
Well, I don't know what it isn't. So I guess that means I don't know what it is.
So you can't learn without experiencing something. I think the development of these ideas for curriculum is probably more well-defined, but I don't know what those definitions are.
So I guess for me, it's an attempt to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Bird number 1 is there's a demand by the university's accreditor, the Higher Learning Commission, that the university show kind of continual growth and improvement, innovation, and so forth, right? So that's what this institution has chosen to display growth and innovation. Second bird is just the chorus of voices that's out there, always demanding more job readiness out of graduates. And so the idea is that the university student will have hands-on practical experience that translates directly into a workplace setting. That's my take on where experiential learning comes from. A lot of people might have a different take. As far as a coherent definition, I don't know that you'll get one. It's just, there's a source to the idea.
So John, if I may follow up on John's follow-up on my question. What's the innovation that's being required by the Board Commission? I don't see what it is. Where's the new thing?
The innovation is making nonsense sound like sense.
And if it's just hands-on experience, which is what the person answered my question with, then what's the difference between a trade school and a college? You go out and do something that's a work experience. Then what's the difference between a trade school and college?
Yeah, but I think there's that tension, right?
Oh, we have bathrooms.
There's a tension, right? There's a tension in our university.
I don't see any tension at all. I think it's just a flabby ass word.
Well, sure. I don't think there's
I feel no
tension. What I'm talking about is like an institutional tension between camps, right? Like you have people that want that job training. You have other people that want more liberal arts education with classical science, right? Like that's a tension that exists. That's an antagonism.
That's the difference between a trade school and college. I mean, I've been at parts of this debate for 45 years. When I was teaching at Marquette, and when I was going to school there as a student, Marquette as a Jesuit institution required all kinds of things that we would never require here. Theology, philosophy, literature, for instance, of everybody, including the engineers. And the engineering school complained because, you know, we got to get these kids ready to get engineering jobs. And the administration, when I was a student, said the right thing. They said, look, there's a school 6 blocks away called Milwaukee School of Engineering. They have no humanities requirements. If that's what you want to be, go there. If you want a liberal education, which is what we're about, then you stay here. But this is what we do here. We're a university. They're Milwaukee School of Engineering. Are we a university or are we a trade school? It's an easy question. Yes or no? One thing is required of one of them. Another thing you can have for the other.
We have different divisions and splits and directions. And yes, there is an idea that the university should provide a universal education.
Right, you want a
well-rounded education. I know. But there is also demand from the state as a public institution to provide job training. And so
we have schools for that.
We do. We also have.
But I mean, aren't there some professions, like the medical profession, there aren't trade schools for that. Like you have to have a bachelor's degree to go through. So what do we do with these?
Well, actually, your comment raises my thought about this. Okay, I have a close friend who ended up dropping out of college and going into business on his own. He ran a garage. He was very successful, but it wasn't long before he figured out that the best employees he had were the ones that had a liberal arts education, in addition to maybe whatever training they would have had as mechanics. And the reason was he found out, okay, these people they don't need me to solve every problem for them. They have the ability to think through these things themselves. Furthermore, they're pretty good with the customers because they've developed certain virtues that make them people that can actually help other people. They asked, he was the kind of business owner that thought honesty was as important as profit. So, these were the people, if someone brought their car in and it didn't really need to be fixed, they would say, you don't need to be here. Or I could just, tweak this thing for you and you'd be on your way. But he actually liked that. And he realized that the people that had this liberal arts education were actually the better choices for employees. I think that's true in all kinds of professions. It's kind of we're being misled if we think that a liberal arts education isn't going to help you in certain fields. It's going to help you everywhere, in whatever you do. Now, you may have to get additional education in a specific career, vocation. A lot of times it's what grad schools are for, or maybe you take your liberal education sequence and then you major in a certain area, and that has more to do with the kind of job you're looking for. But I just think that liberal education is going to be good for everybody. Now, I'm not saying everybody can do it. Not everybody can. And it may not be the best choice for everybody. But if you do choose to do it and you stick with it, I think it can do nothing but good regardless of what career path you decide on.
To me, it's interesting that we have to make that case, that particular case that David just made, for liberal education more and more, right? Like, we can't get away with, so to speak, claiming that the disciplines are worthy of study for their own sake, right? It's always for something else, right? It's because it's chorus of voices, it's demanding job readiness and so forth, is growing and growing and growing, right? And that sort of leads me to, like my initial provocation or answer, I guess, like, why is that the case, right? We need to think about why in our present day universities, right, the humanities enrollments are dropping, right? Why are the humanities being discouraged, right? And I don't think we can really get at the root of that question without asking really fundamental questions about what the university is for in the sense of, I guess, the broader economy. Like, what is the university's function, right, within the nation state, within a national economy, and so forth, right? So there's no way we can answer those questions with the 10 minutes that we have. But that's sort of the direction that, if I could have pointed the direction of this conversation in a certain direction, it would have been that, right? What is education for in that sense, rather than in some kind of ideal sense?
Kind of interested, Frank, what you might say about this, because it seems like the sciences have oodles of practical uses, and use what you learn in science in all kinds of different fields. But in addition, there's always been this idea that just learning something, finding out something for his own sake is a noble pursuit. So in the sciences, I think you have people like you yourself are one of these people, I think. You're interested in finding out what the world is like. Whether or not it has any practical application in any job career or not, it's still a valuable thing to do.
But isn't it more difficult to find funding for basic scientific inquiry as opposed to applied scientific?
I bet it's a lot easier to find it in science than it is in the humanities.
Oh, yeah.
See, I think that part of what we are dealing with, a lot of it is it's a cultural issue in many ways. We as a culture, in essence, we worship science. Look at all science has done for us. And I mean, there's a lot of wonderful things we've gotten through medical science, and there's just, but to some extent, and science is about technical knowledge. and about being technicians and stuff. And so what I see in some respects is the universities have just over time become basically kind of cathedrals to science. And science is become sort of this blessing curse. It gives with one hand, but it takes away with the other. And like I've talked with Dave about this, I mean, I got my PhD in molecular biophysics, and I know a lot of PhDs in science. I don't think I know of a single PhD in science who, as an undergraduate, was required, and I know definitely not in graduate school, required to take a course in the philosophy of science. Now, if you have scientists who they're not being trained with a liberal arts education, then that's kind of like, it points to like a corruption of the system itself, I think. That the system itself has a fundamental corruption because we have become basically materialist in that regard. And we don't necessarily believe in the soul anymore because there's no scientific way we can prove the soul. So when we talk about something being beautiful or good or anything like that, well, what is good or beautiful? Well, it's up to the individual. It's purely subjective. And so you can't, if you can't say something scientific about it, you can't say something objective about it, then can you really say anything meaningful about it? And that's where I think that to me, it's a cultural, it's sort of a cultural shift that again, I'm curious about it just for the perspective of, I find myself in the middle of this enterprise, and I have so many colleagues that are just, they don't really care about where the ideas come from. They don't care about Western civilization. They don't really care about culture. It's just not of something that, and I think that that's not, I think that they're a product of their education in a sense. And our so-called liberal arts education that we got from state institutions had no liberal arts component to it. So those of us who went through state colleges, we came out, we did the general studies, we took our slough courses, and this is the product. This is what you get.
So it feeds into itself then too, because the students that come through these things don't have that appreciation. And when they're hired, they don't look for those things, which sort of feeds back into what the universities try to provide again. And you're providing things that aren't sort of appreciating those arts. And it just circles back on itself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there is and especially in our current like cultural or fiscal climate, I guess, in terms of like, there's a sort of like metaphysical panic going on to some extent as we face declining enrollments. What do we do about that? Well, we've got to market better. We've got to figure out how to market this thing we've got. We've got a product. We've become like Walmart. And how do we stock the shelves with the right courses that students want to take? And we need to market that. And I'm not going to say anything more about that. I'll get myself in trouble. So
I think there is something like a cultural feedback needed. I don't think that's all of what's going on, but certainly, in my experience, it's very difficult to explain to someone who is monolingual the benefits of being built up. Right? They just don't know what they're missing. They have no conception, right? It's like trying to create a bad analogy, it's a list or something. But if you've never experienced it, you have no point of reference.
I just have one final question. I brought it up before, so maybe you had time to think about it. What is administration and what role does it play in education?
I'm going to take up for Mike real quick because he, every time basically before I came here, I was a classroom teacher for 15 years. And my view of administration changed over the years because I had good ones and not so good ones. And at first, sometimes the boss. And sometimes they're a really good person you could be friends with outside of the building. And I came to realize that a lot of times they had to wear a lot of hats. They had to hold you accountable and help you meet the standards at the same time. There's not like to get after you if you weren't accountable, but other areas to help you get to where the accountability was an issue. And there were times they were very much stuck in the middle between unpopular district or state initiatives. And they were teachers too, as I know how hard it can be, but it's like, we know this child is tearing you up and it's very, very difficult to deal with. And you got 20 other students in the room, but they can't leave. And so I don't know how many hats that is. There's more hats we spent 2 hours on the hats the administrator wears. But a lot of times I did find they were sometimes the most tortured soul in the building because they've been there, done that. They still need you to keep going and doing it. And they're trying to help you be successful, knowing they have to chew you up if you're not successful at the same time. So there's a reason why I came here and spent 3.5 years in grad school to pay off with my life insurance when I die, versus taking 2 more classes and becoming a principal. I'll tell you this story every time. So there it is. It has to be one of the toughest jobs in education because sometimes you do a lot of great things, but sometimes you're really, really stuck, in the middle sometimes of a lot of things. So I know it's not easy.
So we're a community that is ultimate goal is to educate students. And if you leave every single professor alone to educate students, they're going to go in all kinds of directions. And so there needs to be some guiding principles, and there needs to be some accountability for following those principles. And I think that's where the administrators sort of step in. It'd be nice if the academics would be able to do that on their own. But like I said, we're going to be all over the place. And so some of that is where I think the role stands.
So they're cat herders.
Yeah.
And also, all my answers have been granted that I'm not a college professor who used to be a teacher. I'm a teacher who now works in a college. So you can think of my answers. All my roles at K-12 legs. So there's a college administrator too, which I would say it has a lot of the same hats and stuff in it a lot too.
I can answer. And it's interesting because I would tell you it's situational. And you talk about the number of hats you wear, it's all situational. I work with school leaders across the state and across the country. And it's all situational. And I will tell you, to your point, the last 2 years have been hell for people in leadership. Because no decisions, there's no lack of opinions on administrative decisions. But really kind of the role as for an administrator in whether it's school districts or college or whatever, is to assist and guide and support those that are on the front lines so they can have the most positive impact on the students that are in our charge. The challenge with that, it's all based on perceptions. If you think about back when you were in high school or even elementary school, or as a faculty member in higher education or a teacher in a school, sometimes you look at those decisions and go, where in the heck did that, how in the world did they make that decision? But it's all based on perceptions of the individual that's judging the decision because it changes. I can use a good example. Last night in my finance class, we were talking about cost per pupil in school districts because in a state like Nebraska, it varies. From the point of, in a larger district, that cost per pupil might be $8,000 or $9,000 per student. And in some of our small rural districts, it's $40,000. And so there's a dramatic difference. And so the conversation we had for actually quite a while was how in the world is that fair and why is it different? Because it's situational. Every situation is different. I go back to Mullen, Nebraska. There are students that travel 45 miles one way to school in Mullen, Nebraska. They can't go anywhere else. And there's only also going to be maybe 140 of them. And you have to turn the lights on whether 140 kids show up or 1,500 kids show up. And so some of those costs are inherent to that size. So it all becomes situational. Things such as masking, things such as snow days. I would tell you, as a superintendent, that was the worst day. I hated snow days because no matter what decision you made, a lot of people disagreed. For the families that had 2 parents at home, or at least a parent at home, Snow days were awesome. You make cookies, you turn on the fire, you read books. How much fun is that? But for the family, the immigrant family, where the business doesn't close and both those kids have to, or both those parents have to go to work, and the 8-year-old is watching a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, that's a different perspective. And so I think when you talk about administrators, whether it be at the collegiate level or at the school district level, actually on most businesses, it's situational, dependent upon the situation, but it's also based on perspective. One of the interesting things is that knowledge and lack of knowledge, lack of communication can have a huge impact, but we all have a different perspective. So back to the cost per pupil issue. There happens to be one of my former teachers in the room in the finance class that I'm teaching. And in the district I was in, because of growth, incremental growth in our district, and for math people, it was a step function in that you were able to maintain staff for a certain point and eventually hit a number that keyed adding a position. When you add a position, obviously the cost per pupil goes down. For my Board of Education and leadership, that was almost a badge of honor that we had an extremely low cost per pupil. The teacher in the room, I said, so what's your opinion on that? I said, we as teachers thought that was horrible. We thought we were underfunded. We need more staff. And so then it comes back to that perception in that it just depends on from where you come. So as administrators, what I talk to my students all the time is we have to figure out ways to support our teachers and give them the ability to do their job in a way that it impacts kids and changes lives, while balancing the conflicting opinions at all levels. You mentioned you had good administrators and poor administrators. I will tell you, some people think I was a good administrator and some people think I was a poor administrator based upon some of the decisions I made, because all decisions are personal. At the college level, you talk about some of the mandates that come down to the college level and administrators have to make decisions. That doesn't necessarily work with all the faculty. It doesn't necessarily work with all the students, but eventually a decision had to be made. I think the mask issue is just the greatest example, because that looked different in all the school districts. It looked different on the university system. UNL, UNO, and UNK all had different responses to the mask question. And that is an incredibly divisive conversation. And so it's not an easy job, but it's rewarding if you can work with a team, develop collaboration, bring teacher leaders involved in the conversation. There's all sorts of things. I could go on for the rest of the way longer than we need, so I won't. People are getting tired.
I was just going to say, when I was first generation college student. Neither my parents had gone to college, and when I first got into teaching, university teaching, I'd always heard it referred to as academia, and I thought of academia as, I had this sort of like very idealistic opinion of academia, faculty and colleagues getting together in a department, and then I encountered administration and just destroyed my vision of academia. So I guess it does depend on perspective.
I'll clarify a little bit more about my cat burger. So we do, as a university, have common goals of educating students, and I said we're all in different directions, and they stood there and they look at what all of those directions are and try and figure out where the flow is, and they try and create policies to make that flow more efficient. That efficiency question, that's a question, but the goal is to come up with the right policies to create the best education for the students in the most efficient way possible.
I guess I am an administrator. I don't know. I direct the philosophy program. There's only 4 of us, so it's pretty easy. Plus, I get along really well with my colleagues, but I kind of feel like my job is to do the things that the rest of them it would be an obstacle to them, to their teaching. I mean, I really like your idea that this is really what administrators are supposed to do. I think that's the origin of the word, isn't it? Administer, aid to the minister. So the teachers are the ones ministering to the students, and then the administrator is the one that helps them do that best they possibly can. That's kind of how I've always thought of my job. So I do the things that nobody else wants to do and makes it easier for them to do what they do and do it well, you know? And of course, that sometimes means we have to talk about things together, so on. But I don't know that that really changes the higher you get up. I do think that there are special temptations that administrators face. One of my favorite books, you should read it sometimes, by a fellow named Richard Mitchell. It's called Less Than Words Can Say. And in the first chapter, he talks about his friend who became an administrator, and all of a sudden he was speaking differently. He was using the passive voice, and he talked about things happening rather than him making things happen and so on. And he tells this story kind of tongue in cheek, but he wonders, what happened to my friend? And he figures the best hypothesis is there's a worm in his brain that affects his speech center, and now he just can't talk like he used to. So it's kind of funny, but I think it illustrates some of the temptations and dangers that face someone who gets into administration. There's definitely temptations in any walk of life, but I think there are some that are peculiar to administration. I wouldn't really know what all those are, but some others might know it pretty well, you know.
So getting department chair, quad administrator.
Yeah, you're one
on
too.
my administrative hat.
Yeah.
And say that from my perspective, the function of administrator administration is to prevent unmediated access to resources. So we are here to stop the body faculty, students, certain students. We can't have you guys with direct access to money. You might do something with that money that we disagree with, that politicians disagree with. Right? We can't have that. Administration also exists as kind of a, certain levels as a veto on policy decisions. Because again, we can't give faculty, staff, definitely not students, any kind of real decision making power. If you have that, you might change your mind about what a university is and what it does. And certainly we want to prevent that at all costs.
So I actually met with a young lady last night who was just recently named the Nebraska Principal of the Year for the rural school districts. It was interesting because this question came up with her, because I have teachers that think they want to be administrators. And their question to her was, how do you make decisions? Her answer was brilliant. She said, my first consideration is, how does this impact our children? That was her first consideration. And when all of her decisions go through that, because when they're building their district, they have very limited control to the money that you talk about. But her point was, her goal, her job within the finances was to advocate for things that allowed her teachers to support their children and to make sure children were able to benefit from that. And so if we take that to this level, I can't imagine that's not the same. And to your question on experiential learning, which I also don't know what that is. I don't know. I've heard that. And it's just because I don't know. I just haven't been here long enough to know. But part of the goal of administration is to make sure you as college students get what you need to address your why. Because you're all here for a different reason, but you all have a why. And so if the teams work together so that you can meet your why, that's what we're here for. Because all decisions are personal. We all take those internally and decide, okay, what do I want to do with that? And why is that important? If it gets in the way of our job, that makes it harder, but we also have to think big picture. A lot of times it's all based on that perspective on there's different spheres of influence that come into play, and sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we don't know. It makes it pretty difficult. And they don't know because they don't need to know. But again, the fun part about my class last night is they said, we think all new teachers should have to take this class. They shouldn't wait till they're in a principalship program to understand school finance, because they don't know. And a great comment was, we didn't know why they didn't add that extra teacher. I've looked at the numbers, they couldn't afford it. their enrollment's declining, they're losing a student population, class size are getting small enough that they just can't afford it. And so, yeah, I think that's important to think about that, as we go forward, that teacher and that administrator working together, support the kids first.
Any other comments to that question from panelists? All right, well, thank you to the panelists.